Hey friends, welcome back to Homestead on a Prayer. My name's Jennifer. As you can see, we're out in the garden today and we are going to be getting a really important garden task done today. Now, I'm not going to lie to you guys, this is not one of my favorite gardening tasks. I don't find it all that enjoyable. You know, there's some gardening tasks that are a lot of fun for me. Harvesting, of course, is a great one. I like planting, I like sowing seeds. There's a lot of garden tasks that I really do enjoy. Mulching is not really up there really high on my enjoyability list. But it is really important, and so we are going to make time to get some mulching done today. Now, we're over here in my new side yard garden, and you can see I have lots of crops growing here, and these plants are not mulched. Now, you can see lots of bare ground between these plants. Now, there are quite a few reasons why I like to mulch my garden, and why you may want to consider mulching your garden as well. Now, I know not everyone has the same growing conditions, and so there's going to be different advantages and disadvantages depending on your individual climate. But I think overall in most climates, I think mulching does have more benefits than negatives, I guess. So probably the biggest benefit that I have noticed with mulching, and the main reason why I do mulch, is because it conserves soil moisture really well. Now, when you water your plants or when it rains, you know, the ground is going to absorb as much of that water as it can. But what happens, especially in the summer, which is of course the time that our gardens are going to be the most abundant and the time that we really want them to be producing. In the summer, the sun's heat is so hot and it's so direct, and it can really evaporate that soil moisture really quickly before it has a chance to sink deeply into the soil, before the plants have a chance to absorb it. And especially if you live in an area where rain is really scarce, or you have water restrictions and you're not able to water a certain amount, or if you're in an area where you maybe have to pay for however much water you use, pay for a water bill, something like that, there are a lot of reasons why you may want to consider mulching to conserve soil moisture. Now, out here in my main vegetable garden, you can see that I have these beds here mostly mulched, but you can also see that there are some bare spots in the beds. Now, that is partly because I ran out of straw partway through this mulching job. I just didn't have enough to finish, so I had to go pick up some more. The other reason is that I planted some seeds in the soil, and a lot of them hadn't germinated yet. Mulch does make it a little bit challenging for seeds to germinate, so I left the spots where I planted those seeds bare to allow them easier germination, and I'll be filling that in once they're germinated. So you can see here I planted some zucchinis, and actually the second seed is germinating now. I left this area bare of mulch. You can see surrounding it I have straw, but I left this area bare to help the zucchini be able to germinate more easily. And then moving on down, you can see I have some bush beans here, and same thing. Those were planted and I left this area bare to help them germinate. Now, mulching was especially helpful in my garden last year. Last summer, we had probably the driest, or at least one of the driest summers I can remember. We went months with no rain. And while I did have to water my plants quite a bit, mulching, I think, really did help them to survive that drought a lot better than they would have had I not mulched. When you water and the soil is mulched, you can feel underneath it hours later and see that it's still moist. As opposed to watering just a bare, exposed plot of soil, the sun will just really evaporate that really quickly without the mulch to hold it in place. So you can see over here where I planted my peppers, we've got a nice, fairly thick layer of straw mulch. And one other thing that this mulch will do really well besides conserve soil moisture is to suppress weed growth. Now, I did mention earlier about how mulching is not one of my favorite gardening tasks, but I'll tell you what ranks even lower on the list, and that is weeding. I don't know anyone who really enjoys weeding their garden. I'm sure there are people who do, but it's really not one of my favorite gardening tasks. And while mulch, when it comes to weed suppression, isn't foolproof, I still do have to do some weeding. And honestly, depending on the type of mulch you use, you may end up introducing some weed seeds through that mulch. But my experience has been that when you mulch, you get many fewer weeds, and the weeds that you do get are easier to pull. So overall, I find that it makes the task of weeding quite a bit easier. So while it is an investment in time up front to go ahead and mulch your garden, I find that in the long run it really does save time, because it cuts down so much on the water needs of your garden, and it cuts down so much on weeding that you have to do. So here you can see my garlic patch. Now, honestly, a lot of this mulch has blown away over the course of the winter and early spring, but you can see that I did have my garlic mulched pretty heavily with fallen leaves. So a couple of the other benefits of mulch are that it really protects your soil anytime that it's bare, especially say over the winter when nothing's growing. So I planted all this garlic in this garlic bed here last fall, and then it basically, for the most part, at least as far as you could see above the ground, it was really dormant until spring when it sent up its first leaves. Over the winter, it was busy sending down roots and really settling into the soil. But as far as you could see on top of the soil, there was really nothing going on, so the soil was bare. So putting down that nice thick layer of fall leaves did a couple things. One is that it just protected the soil from erosion over the winter, both in the form of rain or snow actually washing the soil away, and also in the form of nutrients just evaporating into the atmosphere. So it helped that soil to really hold in its nutrients. It helped it to just maintain its fertility over the course of the winter. It also provided an insulating layer for the garlic. Now, of course, I live here in Connecticut. In New England, the ground did definitely still freeze, even with that thick layer of leaves. But what it did was it just helped provide a little bit of a buffer for the garlic, just to protect it a little bit from the extremes. So that's another thing that mulch really does. It just kind of protects your soil and protects everything growing in the soil from having nutrients eroded or just from temperature extremes. Now, kind of going along with what we were just talking about, mulch also does protect the soil itself from extreme temperatures. It helps maintain a more consistent soil temperature. So for that reason, if you're wanting your soil to warm up in the spring, you do want to consider waiting a little bit to apply that layer of mulch, because it will help your soil stay a little bit cooler. Now, depending on what you're planting, cool weather plants may see that as a benefit. Things like lettuce or brassicas, like broccoli, plants like that like the soil to be a little bit cooler, and so holding in a little bit of that coolness and keeping it from warming up too quickly can be a benefit. So since growing conditions are going to be a little bit different in every garden, you may want to play around with your specific growing environment, your climate, your specific garden and growing conditions, and see when the ideal time to mulch is for your area. But overall, I do highly recommend mulching because it really does protect your plants in a lot of ways. So we've talked quite a bit about the many benefits of mulch and why I prefer to use mulch in my garden. So let's talk a little bit about the types of different mulch that you can use. There isn't just one size fits all when it comes to mulch, and you don't have to choose just one thing. So as you'll see in my garden here, I use a pretty wide variety of materials for mulch, and honestly, that mostly just depends on what I have available to me at the moment. Now, we've already talked about straw. You've seen that I have my peppers mulched with straw. And over on the other side of this trellis here, you can see I have my tomatoes mulched with straw. There's some zucchinis, some flowers and herbs all mixed in, and I have that all mulched with straw. So another benefit of mulch is that over time it can break down and actually add nutrients back to your soil. All the nutrients that were in it originally will break down and the organic matter will become part of your soil, which will improve both your soil texture and composition and also just be a little boost of nutrients. Now, the caveat with that is that when you're using mulch that's not broken down, if you're using something like straw, you're using leaves, you're using wood chips, anything like that that's not broken down, you want to make sure that you put it on top of your soil only and do not mix it with your soil. Basically, if you're familiar with the process of composting, when you're composting, you need a mix of basically your dry material, which would be something similar to what you're using for mulch, and your green material, which would basically be plant matter, something that's high in nitrogen. And what happens is those two, your dry, your carbon material, and your green nitrogen material, basically combine and break each other down. So what will happen if you're using something dry for your mulch, like say straw or something like that, if you mix it with your soil is going to want to break it down. And what happens is the nitrogen that's in your soil is going to bind with that straw to try to break it down. That basically ties up the nitrogen and makes it not available for your plants. Nitrogen is a really important nutrient for your plants. So you want to make sure, basically, long story short, is you want to make sure to keep that mulch above the soil, not put it into the soil where the soil is going to try to break it down. While straw is one of the more classic and common mulches, it is definitely not the only mulch you can use. If you take a look at this tomato bed here, you can see for my mulch here, this is basically a mixture of dry leaves that fell in the fall and dried weeds that I pulled up. So all along my garden pathways, I get these violets that grow up, and they don't really bother me that much until they get really big and unruly. And then I just take all the leaves. I don't even really pull the roots out, although you can see I did just pull the root out there. For the most part, I just pull the leaves off and just let them dry in the pathway. At a certain point every year, those violets get really tall and thick, and when I cut them down and just let the leaves dry, they just dry out into basically just this type of consistency here. This has some fall leaves in it too, but the rest of it is just dried violet leaves and stems, and that's a great free mulch. Now, the thing to be aware of if you're going to use dried weeds like that to mulch your garden is that you do not want to include the roots. And you also want to make sure that you're using a type of plant that is not going to be able to grow roots out of its stem, send roots down into your garden, and create a massive weed problem. Now, I personally have never had an issue with my violet leaves doing that. I'm not guaranteeing that they won't do that, but I've never had an issue with it. So depending on what type of weeds you have growing in your garden, you may want to research whether or not that's a good idea to do. But I've never had any problems using violets for it. And that is a great free source of mulch, and I find that it really does work well to keep my garden nice and healthy. Now, as we talked about with the garlic, you can see this is just a layer of leaves that fell last fall. I planted the garlic, and then I just scooped up the leaves out of the pathways, piled them on top of the garlic, and that kept it strong and healthy all winter. Another idea is to use grass or lawn clippings, as long as you're sure that they're relatively free of weed seeds, and most importantly, as long as they have not been treated with any sort of herbicide or anything that you don't want to introduce to your garden. That's one reason why I really like using the violets that grow in my garden. I know exactly where they've grown. I know exactly what's on them, and I don't have to worry about inadvertently introducing any kind of herbicide or chemical that I don't want in my garden into my garden. So I find that that works really well. Now, a different type of mulch idea is what's called a living mulch. Now you can see this is my broccoli bed here. I've got lots of these big, beautiful broccoli plants growing, and in between the plants, I planted a really thick carpet of lettuce. Now you can see I haven't covered the entire ground, but you can see in any of the big spaces between the plants, I've got lettuce that's filled in. Now, whenever it makes sense to use a living mulch is actually my preferred method of mulching. You could see in that broccoli bed behind me, I have those broccoli plants. Those broccoli plants are huge, but you know, there's lots of space between them still. Underneath the leaves, there's lots of exposed ground. And by planting the lettuce there, that's actually a symbiotic relationship that is going to benefit both the broccoli and the lettuce. Now, the broccoli obviously needs to be mulched somehow. So rather than add some straw or leaves or something like that onto that ground there, I sprinkled lettuce seed all throughout the broccoli. And that helps provide all of the benefits that we talked about mulch previously. It suppresses weed growth, it conserves soil moisture, and it prevents nutrient loss. It basically just protects the ground exactly the way a mulch would. But it gives me the bonus of the lettuce harvest. Now, the broccoli in turn helps the lettuce, because lettuce, if you've grown lettuce before, you know that lettuce is a great spring crop, lettuce is a great fall crop. Lettuce does not really like summer heat and summer sun, and tends to bolt and get bitter pretty easily once it gets hot. By growing it in the shade of those broccoli plants, I'm extending my lettuce harvest. My lettuce will last longer and taste sweeter longer. So that's a great option whenever it makes sense to do that. So yet another option for mulching material is using what's called a chop and drop mulch. This is actually a little bit similar to what we talked about before, where I mentioned I use the violets in my garden. But you can see here, this is a comfrey plant, and as you can see, this plant is huge. Now, comfrey is probably the most common plant that's used for a chop and drop mulch. Basically, comfrey grows to be a really large size. It grows really vigorously. Comfrey has a really deep taproot. So what that means practically is basically that comfrey sends its roots really deep, much deeper than most other plants that you'll grow in your garden. And the benefit of that is that by sending its roots really deep, comfrey is able to basically mine for minerals, to mine for nutrients really deep in the soil that most plants' roots can't reach. comfrey is able to reach them because it sends its roots so deep. And what happens is the root sends all of those nutrients into the comfrey leaves. When comfrey drops its leaves at the end of the growing season, those materials that it's mined from deep in the earth decompose, but they decompose on the top layer of the earth, which makes them accessible to other plants growing with the comfrey. So what a lot of people do is they'll grow comfrey for the purpose of enriching their compost or to use as a chop and drop mulch. Now you can see the size of these leaves here. I can chop a bunch of these leaves off and I can spread them on my garden. They'll provide all the practical benefits of mulch with the additional benefit of making all of those nutrients that this comfrey has stored up in its leaves accessible to all my other plants. So basically for those reasons, comfrey is a great plant for this. It's also, as you can see, it's a huge plant. I planted this plant last year and it was a small little seedling last year. It's gotten huge in just that amount of time. So I can remove a lot of these leaves. I can chop this comfrey plant down and it would take a lot to kill it. It's very unlikely that I would kill it or even seriously damage it by removing a lot of its leaves. So it makes a great option for a chop and drop mulch. Now ideally I would have purchased this straw from a local farmer. Because I was in a pinch and I needed this right away, I ended up just getting this at my local feed store. So I'm just going to go ahead and spread this out over my tomato bed here. You can see that this is straw. This is straw that's been shredded and chopped finely, which I think is going to be a little bit easier to work with than if I was using full pieces of straw. It won't have probably quite the same insulating benefit. If I had to guess, I've never actually worked with this type of straw before, but I think it's going to be a little bit easier to use. So we're going to try this out. Just going to spread it out throughout the bed here. On the far end there, I don't know if you can see that trellis at the end of this bed here. I have some seeds planted. I planted some melon seeds that are going to climb that trellis. Those have not sprouted yet. So I'm going to leave a little 1-inch border on the edge that won't be covered with mulch. That will allow the seeds to sprout. What I really find the easiest to do in a bed like this is to mulch the whole bed before I have anything planted, or at least before I have a lot of my smaller plants planted. And then when you go to put a seed in, you can just kind of push the mulch to the side and wait for your seed to germinate and then push it back in place once it's sprouted. So you'll kind of figure out what mulching technique works best for you and in your garden. Now you can see how I am carefully spreading this mulch and making sure to get it underneath all of the tomato leaves. And that actually brings up another benefit of mulch that I forgot to mention before. So one other really big benefit of mulch, and I actually can't believe I forgot to mention it before because it is pretty important, is that it provides a barrier between the soil and your plants and also between the soil and the fruits of those plants. That's really important when it comes to, for example, things like strawberries. I mean, that's even how they got their name, strawberries, because they're traditionally mulched with straw. The reason for that is to protect the strawberry fruits from contact with the soil. Coming in contact with the soil both allows pests easy access to the fruit, and it also allows those fruits to rot a lot more easily. Now, when it comes to a plant like, say, a tomato plant, something that is very prone to plant disease, coming in contact with the soil can be very detrimental to the health of your tomato plant. A lot of those leaf diseases can overwinter in the soil, and mulching will prevent those leaves from touching the soil. They also prevent soil from splashing up on the leaves. When you have a heavy rain or you heavily water your plants, a lot of times that soil will splash back up on your leaves, and that can lead to a lot of disease spread. So by laying down this mulch as a protective layer between the plants and the soil, it prevents that splashback from happening, which in turn prevents a lot of tomato diseases. So that is another really important reason to mulch. Protects your fruit from rotting, protects your plants from disease. So I will say, while I don't usually use this finely shredded straw, this is actually the first time I've used it, it is incredibly easy to use. So time will tell if it's going to be as effective as traditional straw, but it's really easy to spread and to control where it goes. So far I like it. So I'm just going to go ahead and get the rest of this garden mulched, Thank you so much for joining me today and for talking all about mulch. It really does make a huge difference in my garden, and I think it will make a big difference in your garden too. So if you have any other benefits of mulch that I forgot to mention, go ahead and let me know in the comments. Also, if you have any other mulching materials that you really like to use, especially if it's something that I didn't mention, go ahead and leave those in the comments too, because I would love to get new mulching ideas. And you know, I'm all about saving money and being economical and repurposing wherever it makes sense to do that. So I definitely love to hear any of those ideas that you guys have. I hope you're having a great day. I hope that your gardens are thriving and abundant, and I can't wait to see you soon. I'll see you next time.